My name is Bob I, middle initial I Mays, known in Farmington as Bobby Mays. Anytime I hear someone call me Bobby, I know it's an old timer from Farmington.
What is your date of birth?
My date of birth was the 18th day of January 1938.
And where were you born?
I was born north of here, north of Farmington proper, on Goose Creek, on what's known as the historic Mays Wilson house, or in behind that house, that was my grandfather's house. But there was 200 acres there that my grandfather and actually he had inherited from my great-grandfather, Samuel Mays. That land remained with the Mays family until he exchanged it with Pettigrew in the 1940s. We had 40 acres behind that. The 40 acres that existed behind it was given to my father by my grandfather, William A. Mays.
Tell me about your parents.
My parents, my father was Robert Henry Mays, Robert H. Mays. He was the son of William A. Mays, who was the ex-postmaster of Farmington. My mother was Bertha Lucille Ballou Baker Mays, to get all the little titles in. My mother grew up out at Highland. She, in fact, grew up, Scott, in a cabin or an old building belonging to your great uncle, Ray Tucker. His wife informed me of that, your great aunt. She lived out there with a rather large family for some time, and then moved out to West 16 on Fred Mays' place and picked strawberries and lived in a strawberry shack. My father, who lived next door, had come back from the Navy. He'd been gone for the Navy for 4 years, and he had been married and divorced, and met my mother out in the strawberry patch, and a romance ensued, and there was ultimately a marriage in around 1933.
Tell me about your siblings.
My siblings, I have one sibling, one brother, Richard Leroy Mays. He also went to Farmington schools. He's 1 year younger than me. He was born in 1939. And he, after high school, went to building houses and improving houses and living in it for a while and moving, and the pyramid business.
Tell me about your family's business when you were a kid. What business was your family in?
My family back to settlement here in the 1830s were all farmers. My dad was a flint rock scratch farmer. I mean, he had 40 acres. He ultimately bought another 40 adjoining it, which ran between Goose Creek and Owl Creek. Owl Creek being on the north side of our property, being dry most of the year. Floyd Blue lived up adjoining that property, the Blue Girls, Maribel and Betty Ruth. They were some of our youngest playmates. But Dad was a farmer. He primarily dairy farming. He worked up from grade C to grade B to grade A, which were large achievements in his life, of course. And he was a hard worker, and my mother was a housewife.
What was your part in the family business?
My part in the family business was being a kid for the most part. And I say that because my parents were wonderful in that they let us grow up as children. They let us be children. They let us, they tried to keep too much responsibility off of us at a very early age. I've seen so many people of my age that were worked to death before they even got out of high school. But they integrated me into the farm work ultimately when I was from 14 on up, and helping or assisting with milking the cows. And of course, grade C, grade B is milking by hand. Grade A is you work up to the machinery. It was a farm that on Goose Creek before we moved out to Savoy, which we did when I was like 12 years old. Losing my track of thought here, Scott.
You're talking about moving out to Savoy.
Yeah. Well, it was not a modern farm, is what I'm trying to say. We had team horses, and we had all the horse-drawn implements. And so I remember driving wagons and pulling rakes and plows and things with horses, putting up hay with horses, putting up hay in loose fashion, not baling, which is another deal. Some wheat thrashing. But you did what you could to help or assist both your mother and your father as a child. There was no compensation, of course, other than love and affection.
What other jobs did you do when you were growing up as a kid?
Well, when I became the jobs that I handled were farm work primarily. I was hired by the farm to particularly in the summer to do hay work, to bale hay, very tedious work, and bale it and pick it up. And I learned to drive that way, the hay truck. Driving the bales of hay over to the barn across the river at Savoy and putting that hay in the barn. I assisted as a younger man when I was at Goose Creek, but I was, like I say, between 6 and 12 years old, I would ride the wagon on top of it and help guide the fork down that would catch the hay and take it up into the loft. But nothing hard.
What were some of your routines around the house that y'all would do?
What were some of what?
Some of the routines, other things you would do around the house.
Well, we had homework, of course, in the evenings from school. But when we came in, we had to take care of the chickens. We had to take care of the pigs. My job included going out and getting the cat, taking my dog, my collie, Buck, taking him out and finding the milk cows and bringing them in where Dad could corral them up and milk them. I would help him with little things. And like I say, when it was grade B and grade A dairy, I would help with the hand milking because we all grew rather proficient at that.
What are some of your earliest memories of Farmington?
My earliest memories of Farmington are that Farmington was very small, very small. I don't remember the population, but it was under 100. I remember the feeling of, and it was not necessarily an unpleasurable feeling, of isolation. Farmington, in your mind as a young person, was like it was 100 miles, Fayetteville was 100 miles from Farmington. The reason being, I suppose, transportation, lack of transportation, dependable transportation. And it was a long ways when you had to drop everything else and go in. So families didn't go into Prairie Grove or Fayetteville, except on Saturday morning. They'd go in, take the eggs and the cream. Usually my mother would have eggs and cream that she could sell and then buy sewing thread. And she handmade our clothes and our clothing. And of course, she handmade them. When I say handmade them, we're talking sewing with a needle and no machine. Sewing by a kerosene lamp. At night. We didn't have electricity until, 1945, something like that.
Tell me more about that. What was that like, getting electricity?
You adjust to anything, and we knew nothing else. You had a daily routine. of cleaning the globes on all the kerosene lamps and lanterns. You would take old newspaper or something and clean the globe because they'd turn black. The kerosene was unrefined at that time. And you always had like a 5-gallon can of kerosene, which was used. Kerosene, by the way, was a magic remedy for any ailment. You stepped on a nail and you would soak your foot in kerosene. You would swab your throat with kerosene if you were hoarse with a feather. Kerosene was used for a lot of things, including lubricant, but it was used to start fires, of course, and it was the fuel that propelled the light in the lanterns and the lamps. Each room would have a lamp, and you had to trim the wicks daily also, which was an art in trimming the wick, which is a lost art right now. I couldn't trim a wick now. But if you trim it just right, you get that perfect flame, and your light is kind of an orange glow. Some people had pardon me, my ragweed is working me over. I've forgotten what I was.
You were talking about the.
This is one of the things that happens when you get a little older, Scott.
You were talking about kerosene and using it.
Well, it was particularly hard or more difficult for people like my mother. Men quit working when they came in from the fields, usually. Now, they would stay down at the barn and repair harness or something occasionally, particularly rainy days. But they would rest up. They would read a book or listen to the Grand Ole Opry or whatever they could get on the inferior radio, where Mother would be sitting in a corner with a kerosene lamp, darning socks. We actually darned socks back then. You didn't throw them away. Of course, the socks were worth darning because they were made of a material that, usually wool. So it was difficult in that regard, but people just adjusted and went to bed early. You didn't necessarily go to bed with the chickens. Some folks did, but when they went to roost at sunset. But people went to bed early and got up early.
Talk about your memories of getting electricity. Where did you live when you got it, and how did that change your life?
It's actually a marvelous thing. We lived on Goose Creek. Most folks now would know that maybe as a drain place. The Drains lived up there. Troy Drain and his parents bought the farm from us. I remember the day that the trucks came in, the REA trucks, we call them, Ozarks Electric. They were stringing a line between the main roadway, up our lane, across our farm, and down across Owl Creek, I guess, where the Blues lived down there. No one had electricity then in that area. Younger folks had to understand that this area did not come out from under the Depression until maybe the early 50s, late 40s and early 50s. And that was part of coming out from under the Depression, is getting electricity. We had the opportunity. They wanted to bring the line through earlier, but my father deducted that he couldn't afford 50 cents a month to pay the bill. There was no cash flow on farms. That was the really critical thing on farms at that time. You had plenty to eat. You had your garden. You had you had your hogs that you'd kill in the fall, and maybe a beef. But you had no cash flow, no money, a source of bringing money in. We got some from milking, but that money usually went right back in to the dairy. Went back into buying another cow or maintenance or keeping up the dairy. I know I was an adult when I discovered that old farm on Goose Creek that Dad had let it go back for taxes in the 30s. And I suppose that he forgot about it, but when we went to sell it, which would have been in the 50s, early 50s. He discovered he hadn't paid the taxes, but nothing had occurred. The state had not attempted to sell it or anything like that. At that time, the clerk pretty much took care of farmers from tax sales. They would build some irregularity into the actual forfeiture to protect the farmers. But when electricity came, remember the trucks, that we had ruts in our front yard up until we moved from that place, and long after, from those big trucks pulling into our yard. Always remembered that, and remembered that electricity didn't mean that your house was wired for electricity. It meant that the wire came through a hole in the front of the house, and you had one wire hanging down from the ceiling of the living room, usually with one 100-watt bulb, and that was it, with a pull chain. Now, you could screw in an adapter that the bulb would fit into that would allow you to plug in an appliance or two, maybe, but we didn't have any appliances. The first thing that was rigged up from the electricity was we had a well outside the house, and we graduated from pulling the bucket up to the reel with the bucket to the hand pump. And that hand pump was a chore, and Dad rigged up. Farmers were great at jury rigging anything. And he took a bunch of belts and an old electric motor he got somewhere, and he fixed it where that a belt went on to the handle of the pump, and it would, when he turned the electricity on, it would go up and down. And that was the greatest thing in the world. We didn't have running water in the house, understand. We're talking pump outside in the well. Never did have running water. Took our baths in number 3 wash tubs, the old galvanized tubs that you'd be familiar with. In the winter, you freeze your back and burn your front. Took many a bath, but you take a bath maybe Saturday night. That was bath night, and everyone used the same water. Interesting thing too, in regard to water, which certainly is very essential to our survival. You always had in the house, since we didn't have running water, you had a water bucket. And the water bucket would be sitting on a table, either in the living room or the kitchen, and you have a dipper. And that dipper would either hang on the wall or just remain in the bucket of water. And if you wanted to drink water, you come in and take a drink. Well, no one ever wiped the dipper off. Hygiene was not something that was forefront at that time. Probably the reason we had so many communicative diseases at the time. But every place you would go, and in the public, there'd be a dipper or an old metal cup or something, you get water. Until we worked up, we had a Woolworth in Fayetteville, and the main reason you go into Woolworth would be to get a drink of water. There were no public water fountains in Fayetteville at the time that I knew of. And you go in and sit down like you were an actual patron and had no money, not a penny. And you'd ask for a glass of water, and they'd fix you a big, tall glass of water with ice in it, and you'd drink it. And that was the service they provided, to the farm families that came in. That's a fond memory. That's a fond memory. People were so different in those days. Times were so different. Things were slower paced. If you were a child, you were usually guilty until proven innocent of whatever offense, because for some reason the parents remembered being children themselves very acutely. Everyone was in charge of you. You went to town and someone attempted to discipline you, they pretty much had the right to do that, as long as they weren't abusing you. and they had some reason for it because the family would back them. God helped them if they didn't, if they didn't use discretion. But it was just a different era. There was no back talk or smart talk or things like that you get from children today. It sounds nostalgic, I understand, but it's true.
You were talking about your appliances. When did you all eventually get a washing machine, and how big a deal was that?
As far as a washing machine, as far as appliances, when we got electricity, probably the only appliance we had when we lived. Now, the dairy barn, we may have had something out there. I'm not sure what that would have been. We had a radio, and we went from batteries were really inferior at that time. We had a radio that ran off that electricity that ran from that cord we're talking about, and Dad would have to hold that in his lap because his body acted certainly as an antenna, and that would enhance the Grand Ole Opry or the Louisiana Hayride he was listening to. Understand, we didn't listen to a lot else, although we did later love listening to the Lone Ranger and all of the serials that they had, the short shows. But you could do that with electricity, where you couldn't do it with a battery. You guarded that battery with your life, because Dad had to listen to the, Grand Ole Opry and Ernest Tubb or whoever. Never really cared for that kind of music myself, but that was part of our life. The only other appliances I can recall would have been when we moved, when I was like 12 years old, we moved to Savoy on the Illinois River, 740-acre farm, dairy farm out there. My father went into dairy business with Ewing Jackson, who was on the school board here for a while, here in Farmington, I should say. They lived on the farm also, and I grew up with their children. Marilyn, the girl, and a couple of boys, Andy and James. They went to school here at Farmington until they moved back to Little Rock ultimately around 1956, 57 when they sold the farm. I went into the military service at that time, and so I don't know a lot of the particulars on what happened on the sale of the farm, but they were just tired of farming, I think. But any other appliances, man, no hair dryers, we couldn't afford the usage of something like that. And I honestly can't think. We got a refrigerator. No, we had an ice box at Farmington at Goose Creek. Understand, when I refer to Goose Creek ran on the east side of the farm, and that's kind of how you referred to it out there. Used to wade and fish that creek, that and Owl Creek, all my boyhood. But we had an ice box, but we would have to haul ice from Fayetteville when we go in on like a Saturday, and it wouldn't last all week, of course, and you just didn't eat things. I think I was probably 11 before I had any ice cream at home. We finally got a refrigerator in the place we sold our milk to, Quality Dairies in Springfield, gave us a bunch of ice cream, and we stuck it in and gorged on it.
Tell me about your earliest memories of the stores and businesses here in Farmington.
For the small town that it was, it had more grocery stores per capita than any place I know of. I think at one time there were 4 grocery stores operating in Farmington. The old Neal store, I'm not sure if that's the oldest one, I think it is, or was. The White store, White's was right across from the school down here. And there was later there was a bakery that came in, the Witters, Clyde and Lawn, I believe Witters brought that in. That was the first time you had a chance for fresh baked, commercial fresh baked bread and pastries. That, of course, in case someone doesn't mention it, that was one of the big advents of my growing up. One of the big events was the introduction of commercial light bread. It was sliced and it was thin and it was light. And my mother, until the day she died, called it light bread. She would never say, go get a loaf of bread or go get me a loaf of light bread. And I suppose that comes from the weight. Not real certain on that, but a good bread today will have some weight to it, some heft to it, whereas like a rainbow bread, a light bread, had very little weight. But that was suddenly seized the women. You've heard the greatest thing since sliced bread. It was one of the greatest things. It was revolutionary.
Tell about going to school in Farmington. What was that like? When did you start and what was it like?
Well, I started, I'd be hesitant to name the year, but I started when I was 6 years old. Around 1942, I suppose. And I remember those were the war years, and I do remember, of course, the first thing you remember at Farmington is Marie Brown. You remember her as being an institution within herself. One thing the students had, they didn't maybe have a lot to eat. They didn't, I know when I went into the service, I ate like a pig because they would load your tray up, and I had not realized, but I didn't get plates loaded up at home. I got a plate and that was it. There were no snacks, no fruits and stuff other than what you grew in the orchard. When you came here, you had love from her, and if she would always see that you got some candy or fruit if she could, and that came out of her own pocket for Christmas or some holiday. The schools were all heated by wood. They had very large metal stoves with stovepipes. The ceilings were very high in the old brick first grade building I'm referring to initially. And the boys were assigned to go out to the woodpile to get wood to bring it in to keep the stove going. Well, you turn a boy loose and he never comes back. He goes out and he sits on the woodpile and you don't see him, and they have to send someone else out after him. And of course the privy was outside, and it was quite a distance actually from the building, and in cold winter days, which we had several of those, snowy days, it was a long haul out to it. It was a large building, but it was outdoor privy type.
Was there electricity at the school when you went?
There was electricity in minimal bulbs, primarily for light. The first year or the first 2 years, I'm not sure, we had no lunchroom, and we brought our own lunches. Mine primarily were egg sandwiches because we had an abundance of eggs. We had chicken on the farm, and that would keep. Egg custard pie because you could hold it, and you trade it with your buddy, I'm sure Boyce Ray and I've traded many a. And while I'm on your dad, Boyce Ray Davis, he was quite a marble shooter. We call them shooters then, but we'd play marbles, and we each had our little bag of marbles, and the bag was a Bull Durham sack that you carry your marbles in, and everyone had their favorite marble, and you didn't want to lose it, but you'd play keepsies sometimes, and keepsies meant you got what you shot out of the circle, you kept. Well, we had another game that was called grabsies, And we played by the grade school, the old brick original grade school, which I'm pointing, but it's right over here. There was a ditch with a bunch of trees. There were drainage ditches all around the school, and we play in those ditches all the time, play war and everything. We get out in those ditches and play marbles. And grabsies meant that when the school bell rang, and the school bell was Mrs. Brown walking out with the donger, and she'd ring it, one of those small bells. Well, Boyce Ray had an inept knack of knowing when that bell was going to go off. I swear he did. I lost all my marbles to him. I don't know how many times, but grabsies meant when the bell rang, you grabbed whatever marbles were in the circle, the fastest one. And he was pretty swift at it. I lost my favorite log roller, we called him, big marble that I had. Your dad and I had the same girlfriend. I can't remember her name. She was a little blonde, and we were both pretty much hung up on her. And I got to ride the bus with her when we left home. He always envied me for that. I understand we're in the first grade. Your dad left, I think, the third grade, something like that, third or fourth grade, and he willed her to me. We were standing out on the playground, and he said, "I'm going to will so-and-so to you. She can be your girlfriend now because I'm going to," he went to Fayetteville for a while, I believe, to school. And we used to joke about that all the time, even after as adults. But
you were talking about playing marbles with Boyce Davis and your friends. What other things would you and your friends at school do for fun?
Steal grapes from the grape vineyards that were north of the school. They were part of Stark Brothers. Bo Hickman lived down below the vineyard, and he's supposed to keep an eye out. He was the foreman, I think, for Stark's. But he liked kids, and his own kids were in school, and he never bothered us. But those good Concord grapes, we lift those when we could. Watermelons. There's an old ford or crossing of Goose Creek down below where we lived that's closed off right now. Someone closed it. I'm not sure who closed it off. But you would drive through, it was a ford, and you'd drive through the water, and everyone washed their cars down there. But that's where they'd eat their watermelons when they'd steal those. You go through there on a Sunday morning to church and see watermelon rinds all over the creek bed the Saturday night before. As far as legal entertainment, the school was pretty good about having cakewalks, pie suppers. Halloween, they would have apple dunking and all kinds of fright things that kids liked, and you'd end up with maybe an apple or an orange or some candy.
What about out on the farm? What would y'all do, you and your neighbors and friends out on the farm do for fun?
Well, about the worst thing you could do on the farm, I used to tell people this when I was juvenile judge, that all the problems that kids could get, all the trouble they could get into. When we were kids, about the only trouble you could really get into on a farm, cutting down a tree or something like that, or shooting the wrong thing with the BB gun or the BB or the rifle when you grew up to that. We had we used our imagination. We had imaginary games that we played, and we would play cowboy and Indian and war, and you'd team up depending on how many kids were there, usually several from the neighborhood, and have war with green walnuts, and that'd put a knot upside your head. You get hit with one of those. We'd have rock fights, just literally square off and have rock fights. You never really thought you'd hit the other guy, which was erroneous thinking.
What about the adults? When you were a kid, what did the adults do for fun and entertainment?
There was not a lot of entertainment. They were tired all the time. My folks were. My folks worked hard. Daylight, we're talking to dark and beyond. My dad would walk behind a team of horses all day long. And he would come in, so he would have gout between his legs, you know, from the perspiration. He'd be in pain from that. Church was a big social function, and I shouldn't put it that way since it's a religious function, but it was a social function, and folks went there to gather together and enjoy fellowship with one another. They would have a change of pace by putting on clean clothes, no suits, just a fresh pair of overalls maybe. And but there was church and there were events at school. The community primarily, it was never really outside the community. You didn't go to movies. We didn't have the money. I was probably 12 when I got to go to my first movie in Prairie Grove, the old theater over there. And at Savoy, there was a community building that a fella would bring a screen and a camera in Thursday nights and show old C-grade movies, you know, but it's a big deal. We would go, the only time we went to movies in town, the folks, adults and children, would be maybe when we would get our inoculations at the courthouse from public health. We couldn't afford doctors, you know. We went to public health and got our inoculations, and Mother would take us to the old Royal Theater, which was on the south side of the square then, and watch a Gene Autry movie. For I think it was a quarter and maybe a nickel or dime for popcorn, and don't think we got a Coke. Cokes, we called it pop. Everything was pop, but we rarely got that. If we got, my brother and I get one, we'd have to split the bottle. So you grew wise. All the kids were the same way. They knew to buy the biggest bottle you could get. You know, the RC Cola usually was it. I told this at Bill Andrews' funeral that I did. Bill brought the first bubble gum that I ever was acquainted with, that I ever saw. And he was chewing, he had a wad of it in his mouth. It was Yank bubble gum, and it came in a sheet, and he got it down at Hale White store. And he chewed that all day long, and we all marveled at the bubbles. Well, when he get tired, his jaw get tired, he'd loan it to one of us, and we'd chew it. And that's the way it was. You didn't worry about it, you know. And it got where it didn't blow many bubbles after a while. It was kind of worn out. Speaking of Ale White store, my dad had made it very clear. He was a stern disciplinarian, and you don't ever go off of the school grounds. You don't leave the campus during school day. I think it was your dad and I, as I recall, that went down to White's store. It took 25 feet or 50 feet, whatever, down there, you know, and we walked down there and we just gawking, looking around. Neither one of us had a penny to buy anything with. And I guess your dad lived in town then, maybe. He was more familiar with uptown than I was. But anyway, we hung out down there a little while. And White's store was they had like 3 cans of pork and beans, and 2 of them were spoken for already, you know. It was one of those deals. And but it was a store, and we were enjoying that time off. And it was during recess. So we come back and we go to school, and I go home that evening, and my dad meets me with a razor strap. That's what he used on me. And he dusted me up good, and I asked him, well, what's this for, you know, and he says, You left the school grounds and you went down to White's store. How'd you know? And he said, well, I stopped in there to get a loaf of bread, and she told me that cotton-headed boy of yours was down here today. And that's kind of what I was referring to earlier, that everyone kind of took care of you. Everyone knew you, and they knew who I was. And so I didn't go down there anymore.
What did you tell me about going to high school in Farmington? What was it like in high school?
I think most of us that were in high school together at Farmington realized, even at the time, that it was a unique time. It was the 1950s, and things were changing rather rapidly. Not like the later 60s, of course, dramatic, but they were changing slowly enough that you could enjoy the change but still yet keep yourself rooted in tradition. We've all talked about this, and it was the greatest time for kids to grow up that this country's had, in my opinion. We didn't have the opportunity to do things like kids today. I mean, we didn't go into town, or now a couple of kids had their own cars. Charles Cade, he always had a car, and I think Bill Andrews had a car. And so they had, and of course the story of Charles Cade is legendary. I mean, he works for old man Walton and makes a good living, makes a good life for himself. But we played a lot of baseball. We played a lot of sandlot football. By sandlot, I mean we played from sidewalk to sidewalk. That was our goals. And if you were tackled on the sidewalk, God bless you. It was rough. But we had no equipment, but we played as rough as you do, I assure you, with equipment. It's a wonder we hadn't killed each other. But basketball, of course, was a big thing at Farmington. I remember baseball. We played in a little field south of the school, and sometimes we would play in a field that was across the highway. I'm not sure who owned that field, but we'd play there. We played the other schools like you do in basketball, the B schools. Had some socials at private houses. The very first one I think I went to, I can't remember who it was that I walked around the house with on Spin the Bottle. You spin the bottle, and whichever girl it points to, you get to walk around the house at night with, which amounts to nothing but walking around the house, I assure you. But I remember not knowing what to do. Had no real social graces there, in that regard. Never thought or dreamed of trying to steal a kiss, or, maybe holding hands would have been utopia. But games like that. And
what did you do after high school?
I left high school immediately, went into the armed services, went into the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force. I went in with J.W. Rue. He's now deceased. That was in July, almost July 4th. It was probably July 5th, 1956. And he and I, of all the recruits, were assigned to Parks, California, which is Oakland, near Oakland, California, for basic training. And for myself, he went on, I'm not sure where he went to, but I completed military police school and Air Base Defense School in Oakland at Parks, and then was assigned to Clovis, New Mexico, as a military policeman, and then was ultimately assigned overseas to Tripoli, Libya, North Africa, and a bunch of places over there in the Mediterranean.
Well, how did you end up becoming an attorney and later judge?
Well, when I came back, I had the fervent desire to finish my education. And so I went to undergraduate school, completed it, and had always had a hankering. I had preached when I was young, some, and had felt the call, and I wrestled with that call to the ministry and call to law, and I felt a compulsion to be a lawyer. I've always wanted to help people. That's why I'm so poor today. But I always felt the need. I wanted to help individuals in need, and I always felt law was a wonderful way of doing it. And I always had the kind of the gift of gab, and so I went to law school right after undergraduate school. When I set up my first practice, I went to your daddy, Boyce Ray Davis, who was running, he had a printing shop in Lincoln at the time. I guess probably had a newspaper too, the Lincoln Leader, if I recall, and had him gave him the honor of printing I laughed and told him it was his honor, of printing my first stationery, which he created and designed and didn't charge me for, as I recall, either. And set up practice in Fayetteville and grew rather rapidly. I had, I think in the first 3 years I had represented the defendant in 3 murder cases, which was kind of unusual. There were no public defenders then. And
what year did you become judge? And let's talk about that.
It'd be difficult for me to say what year. It would have been in the mid-60s. I'm sorry, the mid-70s. And I served for 13 years in that position. And we were able to build a real model for the rest of the state. In fact, really the Southwest in some things, but juvenile justice at that time was really inferior. People were not given justice. The kids were not treated as a human being. They weren't treated as someone with constitutional rights, even natural rights. And I was able to introduce that, treating them just like adults, although they did obtain certain favors as, young people.
What do you remember about how Farmington has gone from the tiny little town to now a big sprawling town? Do you remember the growth, or?
That's pretty rapid. It was pretty rapid and again, you're just a few miles up the road at Fayetteville, but, and I would come to Farmington for things occasionally, and of course we represent a lot of people out here, and would come and visit them on their farms or at their houses. But it seemed to have happened overnight, the large growth. I came out here one day and suddenly there was a Sonic and a McDonald's, and I had not been mentally prepared for that. There were no eating places that I can recall.
If someone asked you to tell them about your hometown where you grew up of Farmington, what would you tell them?
Well, a semblance of what I said earlier, or touching on that, is it was a Mayberry. It was a place where everybody knew you and your folks and knew particulars about you and cared enough to take the time to discuss with you what you cared about maybe. What are you going to do when you grow up? You know, what do you plan on doing after you leave school? They really cared, or at least they gave you the impression they did. Where today, seemingly, the people don't have time. They have cell phones jammed in their face or other electronic devices, and I really have a thing about that. I walk my dog a lot now, and I pass someone on a beautiful day, and I would love to engage in conversation with them, you know, on any number of things. And they've got that earphone stuck in their ears, you know, and they'll nod as they go by. And it's very impersonal. And I think we miss a lot as human beings, as brothers and sisters. I think we miss a lot by not communicating. By not feeling each other, having empathy and feeling each other's hurts and losses and taking time. I'm bad about telling people this in church, but take time to listen to the person next to you because they may be hurting. My respite from the pressure at the office used to be going to the post office to check my mail at the box, you know, and I'd run into other lawyers or colleagues down there, and I could take 5-10 minutes, and I was away from everything. I didn't have a cell phone, and so no one could just reach out and grab me. And so that was my free time. You go in, and someone that you saw, you say, "Hey, Joe, how are you doing?" And they say, "Well, maybe I'm not," you know, and they're trying to tell you something, but you keep going. You don't want to get engaged in a conversation, and there's something wrong with that. We need to stop, and I think I maybe have gone too far on that, but times have changed in that regard. There were people that didn't listen even when I was young, but there were many that would and did, and that meant a lot to me as a young person, for an adult to take a moment and say, you know, what are your future plans? Like I had future plans, you know, I wasn't some kid off over here that couldn't have plans or dreams, you know.
Is there anything you can think of that you want to say that I haven't thought to ask about?
Not really. I don't have a lot to add to what I've said. My family came here. I'm not sure the exact year they came to Farmington. They came here, they were Scotch-Irish, and they came down here from Illinois. They'd worked their way through the Carolinas and Georgia to Illinois and then down to northwest Arkansas. And they settled out at I'm talking about the Mays and the Wilsons. They settled out at the old Drake Field, out in the Greenland here, in the Millers. One of my grandmothers was a miller. And they built a tannery in Fayetteville, down by the railroad tracks. Go down Center Street to railroad tracks, and there's a little creek there, and they had built a tannery, which they'd had similar tannery in Illinois. And they eventually bought a farm, the Mays Historic Farm, or the original farm on Goose Creek here in Farmington. And that would have been my great-great-grandfather, Samuel. But that would have been in probably the 1840s. And two of my grandfathers were postmasters for Farmington. The primary reason being, I think, is we were Union supporters in the Civil War. I say we, my ancestors. My great uncle, William Mays, he went in business at one time with old man Johnson at Johnson, Arkansas. That mill they have there, he's responsible for rebuilding that mill back after the Civil War. He and my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my great-uncle were in the Battle of Prairie Grove. They were conscripted by the Confederate Army, as many were, and my great-uncle, William, talked about turning over bodies at Prairie Grove looking for his brothers. The old Mays place was used as a hospital after that battle. But that's when my people deserted the Confederate Army. The records show they deserted, and meaning they joined the Union Army. And William became, even though he'd fought the Battle of Prairie Grove as a Confederate, he became a Union officer in artillery. He fought in the Battle of Fayetteville and fought, I think, Wilson's Creek, and he saw a lot of action and settled out at Johnson. So, answering your question is, I've got a lot of heritage here, and as do a lot of other people here. A lot of old names that go back.
If I ask you to complete this sentence, how would you do it? My favorite thing about Farmington is?
Well, my favorite thing about Farmington now would be my memories. It'd have to be my memories. I've had very little close or intimate association with Farmington as a community in my late adulthood, other than camaraderie with my colleagues here. But my favorite memories would be what I've enumerated earlier, is the closeness of the community. Again, everyone knowing everyone and knowing where they lived and knowing directions to where they lived. And those directions are so different than now. You go to MapQuest now, and in those days it would go to, Old Tipton's garage and turn left and go down to so-and-so's, the Blues Barn, and turn that. And everyone knew those directions. But that's what I'd remember. And I would remember the love that the teachers at the school gave us, which some of the kids may not have had that in the homes they were in. Fortunately, I did have a loving home. But the teachers took care of their children like they were their own natural children. And that's changed a lot. And it's necessarily changed because the teachers had to, because of the pressures, and they just can't handle it all. But and they would give from their own resources, their own pocket. If a kid couldn't afford something, somehow the kid got it, and it would be the teacher that had funded it. And they had a very low salary, of course. But for me, it's the memories, and they're very vivid, very real memories, impressions left by a farm community of good people. Everyone was farmers, and